I will have you know that I filmed this well over a week ago and then went to edit it, and lo and behold, I had filmed this in slow motion. What an Egypt. So here we go again. Hi everyone, it's Jenny. Welcome back to my channel. I am here to finally do my history challenge wrap up. And I know I didn't do as many videos as I promised, and I'm sorry, but you know, life. But I did have a very good reading 2 weeks. So I'm just going to get the disappointment out the way first. So I DNF'd The Memory of Love by Assata. I just didn't really connect with the characters. I don't know if I'll try again. It wasn't a bad book. I just realised that there was still quite a lot to go, and I was finding it hard to focus on it. So never mind about that. But all the other books were great. And actually, one book that I wasn't expecting to read, but was just in a sale, was All the Young Men by Ruth Coco Burns, and I loved this. It is about a woman in Arkansas who during the 80s and 90s helped gay men who were dying of AIDS, and just really created this kind of community. And it's wonderful because she wasn't part of the queer community. It's just such a rare thing that someone who wasn't around queer people helped them, because it was just so stigmatized. And it obviously it's a sad read because some wonderful people die, but it's also just really inspiring and strangely kind of hopeful. Just that there's, you know, some good in the world, I suppose. So would highly recommend that. And she reads the audiobook herself, and she has great comebacks, so that was a fantastic read. And then I also listened to the autobiography of Malcolm X, and this was one of my civil rights reads. I found this really interesting, particularly the first half. I gave it 4 stars because he got a bit kind of more preachy in the second half, and I wasn't as interested in that. I was more interested in his early life because I knew nothing about it. I didn't realise what a traumatic upbringing he had. His father was brutally murdered by a racist group. He was taken away from his mother. He was one of 8 children, and they were separated. He was into crime at one point. It was really fascinating, like the turnaround in his ideas, and also how his ideas developed from being focused on specifically black people to then widening out into wanting to have more of a coalition of other races as well. It was definitely like an education for me, but I didn't enjoy it as much as the other audiobook I listened to for my civil rights theme, which was Assata, an autobiography. This was great because I realised that a lot of the civil rights people we focus on are men, and it was really interesting to read about how women, or this woman in particular, was treated or mistreated. And it's pretty rough, obviously, but also it's quite nice because she didn't die. She escaped to Cuba, so it's quite nice to read about someone who, just wasn't assassinated, basically. And also just looking at a different group. So you have the Muslim Brotherhood with Malcolm X, and then she was dealing with Black Panthers a bit, and her like disagreements with that and how things changed throughout time. And then the other kind of civil rights book that I read physically, actually, where is it? Hello, here you are. Was even A Gift of Love by Martin Luther King Jr. This is a bit different because it's not a biography or autobiography, but it is a collection of sermons that he gave. But he was an incredible orator. There's just everyone knows that, there's no doubt about it. Just so eloquent, and there are some really challenging sermons in here, especially the one about loving your enemy. I can't imagine how hard that must have been to hear if you were a black person alive in the 60s in America. Wow. I think you can read this even if you're not religious, because it's just his philosophy about love and life and the freedoms that every person is entitled to, no matter their upbringing or the colour of their skin, is obviously still completely applicable today. He was interesting to read alongside Malcolm X because he is so anti-violence and talks about Gandhi and that kind of thing and the way that he protested. So just great to get kind of an amalgamation of how, like, yes, civil rights was being fought for, but in different ways with different techniques, and how learning how they sort of like interacted and overlapped a little bit. It was great. I'm really happy I read them all together. And then I read Eggs or Anarchy by William Sitwell, which is all about Lord Woolton, otherwise known as Fred, who was the man who was put in charge of the food cabinet, I don't know what you call it, but no, the food minister, that's it. So he's very interesting actually, because he came from very humble beginnings, and it was a Tory government at the time, Conservative government, so most people in the cabinet of the government were long-term MPs, were from private educated backgrounds and much more upper class than him, at least in terms of their origins. And he came in as a businessman, someone who had never been an MP but had just done really well with department stores, and the then Prime Minister Chamberlain brought him in, and there was huge doubts around him, especially when Church became Prime Minister, because he didn't have any political experience. So just really interesting in how he approached things so differently because he approached it as a businessman and not a politician. He wasn't worried about being re-elected or anything like that, or his position on a long-term basis, although he did afterwards go into politics, which I just found so interesting. And he came from Manchester and quite an impoverished background, so he really cared about feeding people and making sure that everyone had a baseline diet. So it was really interesting. I would say there's a couple of chapters that are a bit repetitive. There's one that talks about all the ships that were sunk, that were crossing the seas from all the different colonies we had, because we still had an empire back then, that was transporting food, and it does go into a lot of detail. And while it's interesting and obviously quite horrifying to think of how many people died in that way, there are a lot of examples, and that I found a bit long, and the black marketing chapter wasn't quite as interesting as I thought it would be. But what I really liked about this book is that it has a lot of his diary entries. He meticulously kept a diary, and it's just really great to have such a private and therefore no holds barred account of what he was thinking and how he felt in certain situations. So it was a really niche topic, but it definitely made me want to read about World War II in this way rather than just a sweeping overview of the history. Then the other book that I read that's World War II themed was Blitzed Drugs in Nazi Germany by Norman Ochley. This was great, so fascinating, and took a lot of research of what I think are pretty indecipherable notes from doctors, because there are some pictures in here that show that. This focuses not just on Hitler but also on the general population and how they were prescribed a pill called Pervitin, which is basically a methamphetamine to perk them up and increase productivity and just help with your general mood. And it was quite shocking to hear how you could so readily buy it over the counter at the chemist, and how they were, as a country, they have this history of developing opioids, and they're quite advanced in that way. I had no idea. And then the rest is about Hitler and his personal physician, who originally had this very healthy practice in Germany, and then he was commandeered for Hitler as his personal physician, and how he was very into developing vitamin injections. And I was just so shocked at how ill Hitler was, and I had no idea. He just sounds like the weakest leader, and I almost couldn't believe that the war went on as long as it did when I read this, and the huge amounts that he was given of various different opioids and just all sorts. And there's a picture that I'm trying to find, obviously now I can't. Oh, there it is. So this is Hitler with his doctor. Just so interesting, and it also talks a little bit about what happened after the war, when Hitler committed suicide, but then the doctor was still alive. Oh, so interesting. And how he couldn't be charged for war crimes, but other people were charged for war crimes, and also the politics within the doctors, about how there were some other doctors that wanted access or didn't agree with what this doctor was doing because he was giving Hitler so many drugs. Oh, just so interesting. My favourite bit though was just learning about how the invasion in France basically happened because of this drug Pervitin that they made, because they had to keep going 3 days and 3 nights without stopping and just no sleep, and they all just got really drugged up on Pervitin, so they kept going and thinking about how different the war would have been if it wasn't for this drug being made. Maybe they would have never invaded France, who knows. Just mind-blowing, truly. So good. And also the author is normally a fiction author, so I think his descriptions are quite good and it reads really well. And sadly, as quickly mentioned, I did not even start the Victorian city, but I'm hoping maybe I'll put this on my Victoria TBR, but that is a big maybe. But I would like to. Then we're going to finish up with a fiction, baby. I have Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which was very good, but it wasn't quite what I expected. So I went into this knowing it's about the white man colonising Africa in the 1890s, and it is that, but the actual majority of the book is so much more about the African village and the surrounding villages, traditions and their harvest season and their way of life in general. And that's actually really important because it shows what a huge catalyst the white man is and how much they disrupt the culture, especially when there's a real split in the village, when some people begin to be converted but then others are not convinced. And it's just, it's really well written, and I think I hadn't read a book that focused so much on the before and the whole world that was invaded. So I think that made it really effective in that way, in understanding what a wrench that would have been to have your land just taken over and a church built on it when you have your own ways of doing things and that being erased. I definitely want to read the other ones. I think they are set a bit later and they're not exactly linked, but they sort of overlap a bit. So I'm really glad I finally read this. And then I also finally read The Butcher's Hook, which I enjoyed. So it's set in the Georgian period. You've got Anna, is that her name, or is it Anne? It's Anne, sorry, Anne Jacob, who's in love with Fub the Butcher. Oh no, there's a class difference. So I felt like the class difference was done really well, especially about the fear of being discovered and being seen. So it was a fun romance because it wasn't actually like super romantic, because Anne has very dark plans for how she thinks they can get together long term. So I enjoyed it because I felt like it also really depicted London well from that period. There's nothing historically going on. Like, interestingly, the author writes in her note that in this year that she's chosen to set it in, nothing was particularly happening in the world, but that just means that she can really describe the detail and you can have that sense of being there in the streets, which is so dirty, and all the different sights and sounds and smells. Like I think she writes that really well, and that's quite fun because you just focus on the characters then and their own story. So again, so happy to have finally read this. I can finally do a 5-star reveal video if I was right or not, because this is the last one on my list. So yes, really, really good history challenge. I'm already excited for the next one. Will I manage to read this before then? Who knows? But let me know what you read, or just what the best book you read last month is. It's all reading, man. It's all reading. But I had a great time, and if you enjoyed it, I hope you did too. And I will see you soon on Bookish Shenanigans. Bye!